And hello, welcome to another episode of AWS on Stack Overflow. I'm John Rotenstein. I'm a developer advocate with AWS in Sydney, Australia. I spent a lot of my time answering Stack Overflow questions, and I thought, why not make it a stream so you can join in, learn a few things about AWS. We can have a nice chat together about AWS and answer questions, make lots of people happy. So if you're watching me, I always like to ask, where are you calling in from the world? I'm looking for exotic places. We can zoom in with Google Maps or something, have a look. My favorite so far has been Bermuda. I've never zoomed into Bermuda. I love zooming into things with Google Maps. I one time arranged a holiday to New Zealand by camper van with my family, and I'd zoomed in so much and figured out camping spots. It felt like it was already there when I visited. G'day Brads, good to see you back again. You must always be online watching AWS on the Twitch channel. Talking of watching things online, I just did a search for Stack Overflow, how to ask a good question on YouTube. And there's a favorite video of mine I'd like to highly recommend. This is by Jeff Atwood, who's one of the original creators of Stack Overflow. And it's a 1 hour presentation, you can go through it quicker, that he did for a Korean user group, and he explains what's involved in asking a good question. Now, I've never asked a question on Stack Overflow. I've answered plenty of questions on Stack Overflow, but he gives a really good explanation of the rigor that people should go through, things like writing a good title, giving good code examples, explaining what they've tried, and it's also made me a better answer of Stack Overflow questions. So I highly recommend. I'll put a link to that video in the chat. Fantastic. So for those of you who just joined in, my name is John. I'm a developer advocate with AWS, and we're going to play with Stack Overflow and answer questions. Please let me know where you're calling in from, and if you use Stack Overflow very much. Do you use it for finding answers, for providing answers? So it's always interesting taking a bit of a ride through Stack Overflow, and as I do this, I'll be pointing out various Stack Overflow capabilities in here. And I saw one here that I've never really spoken about, and it's called Bounties. I've never participated in a bounty. A bounty is the opportunity for people to say, this is a question I would really, really like answered. I'm willing to offer additional reputation to get an answer for a particular question. So they can say, okay, you might only earn 15 reputation points normally for answering this. I'm willing to give you 100 points. And they literally take their own reputation and assign it to other people. I don't know whether it gets a better answer, but I have noticed that it tends to get more people answering questions, hoping that they can gain the bounties. Czech Republic, fantastic shader. Costa Rica. Oh, I'm gonna do it. Let's. I've never Costa Rica to myself. Any particular part of Costa Rica? Very nice. Presumably San Jose. Wow, looks like you're all crowded in between the mountains. Love that. Very nice. And the Czech Republic, fantastic. So here I am sitting in Sydney, Australia. It's spring, the sun's coming out, our trees are starting to bloom, and for you folks, it's going to get a little bit colder out there. Wow, that's pretty dense in amongst all those mountains. Beautiful. Thank you very much for introducing me to new things. Yeah, it's amazing when you drop in a Street View. So my son was doing a project on, there's no Street View here. Don't you folks have Street View? Okay. My son was doing a project on Singapore, and he's never been there. How would he know what Singapore's like? And so we just hopped into, nothing to do with Stack Overflow yet. We'll get to that. So we hopped into Singapore and just pick some random place, and then you drop in with Street View, and you get a nice idea of what things are like. Random place in Singapore. We've dropped inside a restaurant with lots of alcohol. That's fantastic. And a travel agency. Let's go out to the street. No, take me outside. Okay, so just by looking around at things, you can see, it's obviously high density residentials from very nice. He basically said it's a very clean country. So fantastic. Denver's a great place too. I must visit there in the winter and the summer because different ways to take advantage. Okay, let's talk Stack Overflow. So for those who just joined, I'm John, and we're going to play with Stack Overflow and try and answer AWS questions. I'll do a quick look to see if there's some recent questions, but I've marked some earlier that we can play with. You might occasionally see red things pop up on my screen. This is a Grease Monkey script that I've added, and in fact the Grease Monkey script is available via my bit.ly link, and it highlights tags that I like to correct as I go along. So if I open this question, it will automatically replace this Amazon tag with Amazon. Oops, turned off my Grease Monkey script. Turn that on again. Fantastic. So now if I refresh this screen, it will automatically replace that Amazon tag with Amazon Web Services. Just a few things I do to clean up a lot of what's going on there. While we're here, what's this one saying? Changing language in Amazon Connect. So for those of you not familiar, Amazon Connect is a virtual call center. And this has taken a lot of popularity with COVID. So a lot of companies are now suddenly working from home, and they're having to have staff in very disparate locations. How do you create a call center and wire up people from home, etc.? And a lot of people are taking advantage of Amazon Connect. You can literally go in there, get a toll-free phone number from many places around the world, set up call centers. It can record the calls. It's got an IVR, that thing where you can say hit 1 to do this, hit 2 to do that, powered by Lambda functions. It can tie into Lex, Amazon Lex, which is the chatbot. So you can have a conversation over there and you say, I'd like to book an appointment, please. And in fact, I'll point you to my GitHub repo where I've got a really great lab if you want to try it out. Connect. Here it is. You can try this lab yourself in your own account. And you subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks, Lakshmi. Got a lot of shows popping out there each week. So in this Amazon Connect lab, you ring up or connect via the web and you can book appointments. You say, I'd like an appointment on a Thursday. It says, we've got a slot available at 2 o'clock. Would you like to book that? Yes. I want it for teeth whitening if you're a dentist type of thing. And you literally go through and build your own call center and drag and drop all of these things. So here is booking an appointment. And then you create these flows and you literally drag and drop flow designs within Connect and say what you want to build up. So really interesting service. You know, you think, why would a cloud computing company want to build a virtual call center? Because we needed something like that, and we assume that customers need it as well. So really great way of going. There it is. Just grab a phone number and program it up. So I don't have a lot that I can answer here in Connect, but I do know that we're now linking Connect up to a lot of services like Transcribe. Oh, it's really neat. When it records a conversation, just like you've got stereo left channels and right channels, Amazon Connect can record 2 channels of sound. So it can differentiate what the customer service person is saying and what the caller is saying. And it can then pass it to the AWS Transcribe service to convert it into text. And because there's 2 channels, it can literally say, customer service person said this, customer said that. So you literally get a transcript, which is then searchable. It can also use sentiment analysis, which I think comes from Amazon Comprehend. So if an angry customer rings up and starts complaining about a lot of things, then a warning can automatically be triggered to a supervisor and they can join in and listen to the call. So amazing stuff that you can do by automating your call centers. So can't answer the question, but it's really fun to talk about. What have we got here? How to filter SNS messages in Lambda while posting to Slack. I created a CloudWatch alert to send a notification to SNS whenever the state of a container changes. The SNS then triggers the Lambda function in order to post the alert to Slack. The problem I have is there's too much information in the message, presumably the CloudWatch message. I want to choose a few fields such as AZ, etc. Okay. So I see this a little bit. I put a comment on here before actually on this, but let's see if we can do some code. So the issue here is CloudWatch is sending an alert. He wants to use Lambda to send it to a Slack message, but he just wants to pull out the individual bits. And this gives us a bit of an opportunity to do some live coding. Yay! Let's hop into Lambda and CloudWatch and start doing a few things. So the biggest thing to learn from this is when a CloudWatch alert triggers, it sends a whole lot of data to SNS. It's in JSON, but it's all contained within a text string that makes things really, really annoying. So I'll give you an idea here. Let's create a function called stack message. I like Python. Give it an execution role so it can talk to SNS, etc. It doesn't have to talk to SNS because that message comes across. And the first thing I'll visit is in Lambda, you've got this test button. And you can choose an event that comes across. So you can say things like, hey, if I get a message from SNS, this is the format in which the message comes. And so the main thing is it's got this message field here. So if SNS is triggered by CloudWatch, there's lots of stuff that comes within that thing. So let's see if we can trigger CloudWatch message to go to Lambda. And in fact, I have a Lambda function here just for this purpose that I call just log. And this Lambda function simply prints the event record to the log so I can see what is coming out. So what I'd like to do is somehow send a CloudWatch alert to that Lambda function. And they're saying here, whenever the state of a container changes, I'm not going to do a container, but let's trigger it on something. So let's say whenever an alarm, select a metric. What metric can I trigger? I could say when EC2, what's an easy metric to trigger? Lambda state SQS. Yeah, what we could do is create an SQS queue. I just need it to trigger an alarm for some reason. In fact, I can manually trigger an alarm just by doing a state. So do I have any existing alarms? Create an alarm on anything. Here for this, my ops instance CPU balance. Doesn't really matter what I'm measuring. And I will say, fantastic. But the whole idea is I want to trigger a notification to an SNS topic and see what information CloudWatch sends to that SNS topic. Stack message SNS topic. If I'm going too fast, Amazon SNS is simple notification service. It's a way to send a message to a topic, and you can have subscribers to that topic, and subscribers then go off and notify you by email, by SMS, by HTTP endpoint, or even triggering a Lambda function. So what I've got here is I've got my SNS topic. I can add a subscription and say, please trigger my Lambda function called just log whenever a message comes into this SNS topic. And finally, I just need to be able to trigger an alarm. Oh, I have to attach it to my SNS topic. And the problem is I just created the SNS topic. So let's go back and hopefully it will list my topic for me. There it is, stack message SNS. And alarm trigger SNS. So I have an alarm that will trigger SNS. Now the trick I'm going to use here is I would like to trigger my alarm to send a warning. And normally an alarm only triggers when it goes into the alarm state. So there are 3 states for alarms. Alarm means the condition is true. okay means the condition is false, and insufficient means I don't have enough information to say so. But what I can do here is I think I can trigger the alarm by telling it treat missing data as breaching the threshold. And that might send a message. If it does send a message, it will go to my Lambda function. My Lambda function will log the information in CloudWatch. Am I confusing you all so far? So, got it doesn't exist, which means it hasn't been triggered lately. So we've got an alarm that I want to trigger. We've got, should send it to an SNS topic. And what I'll just do is I'll edit the alarm to trigger in reverse. Greater than, I'll just say less than. Okay, my alarm has now entered the in alarm state. That will send a message to my SNS topic. That will send a message to the Lambda function, and that should log something in my log function. Isn't doing very much. Oh, something came through. Something came through. Excellent. So here we have an example of the record that has come through from CloudWatch. You can tell it's CloudWatch because it's got all of these alarm messages and all that. So that's fantastic. So that means my event message contains all this stuff. There should be an instance ID in here somewhere. Say which one triggered it, and there is indeed. There is, in the dimensions, there's an instance ID. So the basic question is, how can I get metrics out of that? And the answer is, it is in a field called message. So we've got to extract message. And the interesting thing about message is it's JSON contained within text. So let's try and do something fancy here. I go back to my function and I can say the message equals event message. Can that do it? So the event record has this thing called message. It contains some JSON. So hopefully I can then say import JSON dot dump string, or no, it's load string. Load the string, and then I can hopefully say print something from the message, which will be, let's say, the alarm name. Let's see if that works. So to do this, I'm going to have to trigger the alarm again. The alarm is now okay. I don't want that. Let's trigger it. I don't know what my alarm is doing, but I'm hoping that will trigger something. Balance, critical balance. Balance is greater than 1. Please trigger. Any of you ever done this sort of thing? There used to be a thing to be able to say, trigger the alarm on, and it goes into certain mode. Okay, I'm almost giving up on you. This doesn't work. I assume that it worked. Greater, lower. The current metric is 150 or something. I want it to alarm when it's greater than 1. I want it to alarm over a period of 1 minute. There we are. I've triggered the alarm. Trigger the alarm again. This will trigger the SNS subscription, This will cause my Lambda function to log, and this time it should also log the alarm name if I've correctly parsed the JSON function. Let's go and have a look. Refresh. Not sent another message through. 14. Oh, here it is. You know what I didn't do? I didn't save my Lambda function. What a waste of effort. What a waste of effort. Oh well. The main thing for this person is that they need to, what I've come in here, you need to use the JSON loads function on the message, on the event, get the message out there, and they should be able to construct it out there. So if you ever see anything like that, parsing a message sent from CloudWatch to SNS, you've got to extract the message from there by using a JSON thing. So I will abort my attempts there and not waste any more time. Any of you ever use Amazon EMR? Amazon EMR is our Elastic MapReduce, our Hadoop service. And the way it works is Hadoop cluster. It's a parallel processing service that good picture of what Hadoop sort of does. Oh, there it is. So it has this concept of a master node that runs all of these things. So you might say, please search my terabytes of information for this particular term. It then spreads all the work out to a number of slave nodes, they call it. Not good wording these days. In AWS, we call them core nodes and task nodes, and it distributes parallel jobs out to each of these things. And you can connect to the master node to run jobs, but you normally don't connect to these slave nodes or the core and task nodes. So this person is saying he's got an EMR cluster up and running, and he wants to add a Python package to the cluster. This is normally done by adding a startup job. When the cluster initializes, you can say, please run this job on all of my task and core nodes to install things. But he doesn't want to do that. And instead, they want to SSH into each of the task nodes. Can you SSH into a task node? Don't know if it's allowed. And I don't know if you get the IP address, and the security group would not allow it. I can do a quick attempt before I say you shouldn't be doing it. Go to EMR. So the great thing about Stack Overflow is there's lots of questions on many different AWS services that you might not get to play with very much. So I'm going to create an EMR cluster. You may have never done this before. And I'm just going to go and use the default values and create a cluster, and I can specify the number of instances. So if I say 2, it will give me one master node and one core node. And it will go off and spin that up. So we'll come back in a few minutes and play with that one and see if I can answer their question about EMR SSHing into core nodes, and I'll explain more about why you might want to do that. Those of you who watched me a little bit might have noticed we had a bit of fun last week talking about Australian accents, and I have some news for you. Amazon Lex has released support for the Australian accent. So we're delighted to announce that Lex now supports Australian English. Lex is a service for building conversational interfaces, mate. And sorry, my accent isn't always Australian, but apparently the dialect for Australian is different enough that now Lex, which is the voice recognition chatbot service, can actually handle Australian voices. The Australian poly voices to sound more natural. Fantastic. Nice to know that they're supporting more Australians out here. Okay, let's find one of my questions I marked earlier. See if we can answer. This was an interesting topic. Just it has a good answer, but it's worth pointing out. I often see this. People also, I want to delete an S3 bucket with millions of objects. Is there a quick way of doing it through the CLI command or a script to delete them without going into the console and deleting manually? So the good news, first of all, is that an API call to delete objects does not cost you any money. I think it used to, but when I last looked in here, text here, delete and cancel requests are free when you use S3. So S3 normally charges you for putting, getting, listing, etc., but you can delete objects from S3 for free. So we're not going to charge you for the pleasure of deleting your objects, but there's not an easy way to delete millions of objects. There is this lovely AWS CLI command you can use to remove a bucket with a -- force, and that will go through and delete all of the objects first and then delete the bucket, but it doesn't handle versioning. So if you've got versioning, oops, voice is breaking up. Somebody, it's going better. Thanks for letting me know. If you want to delete lots of objects, if versioning is on, it won't delete them. But a good way of deleting lots of objects is to use a lifecycle policy. So a lifecycle policy is when you go in and say, delete objects that are older than 90 days, just clear them off. And you can actually set that to the minimum value of 0 or 1 days. And at some stage over the next 24 to 48 hours, S3 will actually go and expire those objects, or delete the objects. So it's a great way to go through and delete things rather quickly. We'll get to Redshift in a moment. Instant Store. This is an interesting one I saw and I thought we'd play with. I've launched an EC2 instance, i3 EN extra large. The i3 instances are ones that have lots of local disk storage from my AMI. Then I mount 2 EBS volumes. After an accidental reboot, its instant store disappeared and they can't find it. So this is an interesting topic about instant store, which is spoken about quite rarely these days. And a good way of explaining it is, imagine you have difference between EBS and instant store. So imagine you have the host computer in the AWS data center, and that host computer runs multiple virtual machines. In the old days of EC2, the really old days, there was a disk in that machine. When you booted up the machine, we gave you the disk. You load the operating system from the AMI, you load all your data. But when you turn off that machine, we take away the disk and we then give it to whoever uses the virtual machine next. So you would lose the data stored in your disk. This wasn't too good. Lots of people lost data. So along came Elastic Block Store, or EBS. And EBS is a network attached disk. And when you turn off your instance, the data is still there in EBS. So when you turn on a new virtual machine or start the existing virtual machine, we reattach the EBS volumes and everything is there. But there is still this old instance store on many of the instance types, and you can take advantage of that instance store. And if you go to launch an EC2 instance, you'll see the instance store mentioned. I say I would like to launch an instance, please. It's got this column that says Instant Store. If the column says EBS only, it means this instance type does not have any Instant Store. A lot of our more modern instances don't have Instant Store, but some of our older generations do. So here's some SSD storage attached to the M5s. If you want to have lots and lots of storage, though, you have to go to the not SSD, because SSD is very expensive. I look for that i3 storage. So here's i3. Oh, really big SSD storage. It's using NVMe storage, which is really fast, locally attached storage. And in this case, it has 7.5 terabytes of storage. So let's have a go with what they're doing there. So they created an i3 EN extra large. And I think it's this disk here. Now, I've never really done much with Linux and attached storage. So, g'day, White Knitters. My name is John. I'm a developer advocate with AWS, and we're answering Stack Overflow questions, or at least trying to learn through answering Stack Overflow questions. If you've never attached Instant Store on an EC2 instance under Linux, join me now as we attempt to do this. So the interesting thing is, if you boot up, I'm just going to use a large instance, should be the same. If you boot up a EC2 instance, you'll see this thing here with ephemeral storage. So Instant Store is attached here in the list of storage. So I'm going to get 1.25 terabytes of NVMe storage. What is NVMe? Non-volatile memory host controller interface specification, NVM Express. So it's basically a, oh, they had a picture, a very fast, thank you. No, Siri, I'm not talking to you. Go away. So it's a very fast, locally attached SSD disk, and the reason it's very fast is it uses the PCI bus on your computer. Hey, the assassin, good to have you on board. Where are you calling from? Where are you viewing from, I should say. So I'm going to launch this instance with some instance store. And we shall attempt to mount our instance store. There is some documentation, instance store Linux mount. Way up. So if you're booting a Windows instance and it has instance store, it will automatically come up as your, I think, X, Y, and Z drive. So there's no need to do anything funny. But if you are doing Linux, you've got to mount and format and do all sorts of funny things to your disk. So I always jump to the documentation to figure out how to do it. So here is our instance store volume. Did you notice just the other day the EC2 interface updated? It's now got this more modern look and feel going on it. Wow, I've got an instance that is in Alarm. Ah, that's the alarm I created in CloudWatch. I should get rid of that alarm at some stage. So let's grab the address. Let's log into this i3en large instance using a shortcut I've got. And it looks like on this disk I have my NVMe storage. However, I don't know if I can use it because it is not necessarily mounted as a disk. Any of you good at this sort of thing? So it's saying you can list it and you'll see the disk there. You can then use ls block to see the disks that are here. So it looks like there's some partitions that were mapped and not formatted. And then you come in here and you say, I would like to make a file system on that particular disk. Mine is called E1. Why is it only 8 gig? What did I do wrong? Why is my disk only 8 gig? When I launched i3en, it should be 1.2 terabyte. Something is a bit funny there. 8 gig disk. Did I choose the wrong instance type? Is this not my day? This is an i3en large. Should have a lot more on there. Oh, let's follow the instructions and see what it says. No such file or directory. Dev NVMe. Is NVMe? Maybe it should be that thing. NVMe 1N1. I want to go for that thing there, so I will grab that one there. You missed the O. Okay, so let's give that a go. Now, is that going mad at me over something? It contains a mounted file system already. Okay, I guess it mounted it for me. So the question is, what is it mounted under? Any Unix experts, Linux experts out there who can help me? So it's saying it's mounted under slash. Oh no, used is 1.4 gig, available is that. I'm totally confused. Totally confused over the size of the disk and the mounting of the disk. So I cannot help this person because I cannot reproduce what they're doing. So they've got a similar thing there, which they've managed to mount somehow as data too. And they have a much bigger disk. And I'm confused. NVMe 1, and it looks like 1.1 terabyte. Thank you. Let's block. Ah, this one here. Thank you. I was looking at the wrong disk. That is indeed the correct one. Yay! I love pair programming. So let's do this. We will mount this thing. We'll make a file system on that one. I love it. I don't know why there's an 8 gig. That must be my root disk or something. It's an 8 gig boot volume, and 1N1 is the bigger one, which is showing up as LS block but may not be mounted. Thanks, Brads. That worked. That worked. Now I can create a volume on that. Matches there. And to make mount point. Can mount to that. Yay! So I now have a instant store disk. I'm going to create a file on that disk. Oh. We'll let me save it. Okay. So let's see here. I now have a file on my instant store disk. So the interesting thing about this now is that instant store disappears when you stop your instance, but it should not disappear when you restart your instance, because restarting an instance does not cause the virtual machine to disappear. So we're now going to do a sudo reboot and restart the machine. And this is what I want to test, if this person's situation was just like that. So they said that then they rebooted the machine, the instance store disappeared. I understand that data in the instance store will lost when accidentally reboot, however it disappeared. So if you reboot in the operating system level, you should not lose your data in the instance store. Let's see that's going to be the case. Probably had enough time to reboot. Let's log into it. We have the disk in there. We have that volume, and let's now see if the data. Oh, we lost it. Or is it just not mounted? It's not mounted because we didn't update. There's a file you're meant to update to automatically remount volumes when they reboot. So my lack of FS tab, yes, you're meant to end at FS tab. Now hopefully I can just run this command and it will remount it. Okay. So I think we might have an answer here. That the data is not less during a reboot, but they might not have automatically remounted the volume when it next came up. So that's my NVMe 1N1. Yeah, I think that's what they did. FS tab. So FS tab remount volume. How to mount without reboot. Oh, thank you. Using EBS volumes. Thanks there, John P. Format and mount FS tab. Aha. I have to reboot. Excellent. So let's write an answer. I mounted. Let's link back to the documentation we used here. Got a handy little Chrome plugin that lets me copy it as Markdown, so I can just paste it in there. And the commands we used were thing, that thing, that thing. I then put if you indent by 4, it will also format. So you can indent code by 4 to cause code blocks. FS tab C, how to, no, where was the thing? Making a volume automatically. Copy the link. Okay. So making a volume available for use in Linux. Hopefully that will solve their problem. Thank you, folks. That's one that I could not have answered myself. A nice idea would be an option for auto-generating the script to do this to user data when launching an instance with an additional volume. Yeah, I agree. So the very first boot, you want it to update FS tab, you're right, and then get going there. You'd think they'd provide that sort of script, wouldn't you? I've seen something about that recently, but I think it's to do with a different mounting thing. Yeah. Okay. I no longer need that instance. Let's have some fun. Instead of stopping it, what I'm going to do is change the instance shutdown behavior. You might not see this very often. You know your home computer where you hit the power button and it takes a bit of time and it says, now shutting down, please save your work. And when the power of the computer turns off, it turns off the physical computer. EC2 doesn't know what to do when you have somebody turning off the instance from inside the instance. So by default, it will stop, but you can also tell it to terminate an instance. And this is a great way to run a machine that when it's finished doing what it's doing, you can have the machine terminate itself and it will terminate the instance. So what I can do here, I can now simply say sudo shutdown-h now. The -h is the thing that says, please turn off the power. One time I turned off a machine like this. I just said sudo shutdown and the operating system shut down, but the virtual machine kept running and it was chewing up money. And I went to the support team and said, I think I found a bug in EC2. And they pointed out, no, you've got to do this alt command. Otherwise, it doesn't actually turn off the virtual hardware that is running your instance. So you do the -h. I go into my list of instances here now. We can see that the instance store instance is shutting down, and then it will enter the terminated mode. Fun way of turning something off. Oh, what are these other machines? These other machines are my my EMR instances. Let's pay a visit to the EMR console. Everything's running here. You'll see it says that I've got one master node running and one core node. These are just EC2 instances. EMR does not hide the fact, hey, it's terminated. EMR does not hide the fact that EC2 instances are being used for EMR. So I'll just label these instances. So you can actually go in and pretty much do what you want to those instances. It might confuse EMR, but it's fully open for you. And in the EMR console, it will then tell me that I can connect to my master instance. Boy, it's been a while since I've been here. Establish an SSH connection. And here it's giving me the master node of my Hadoop cluster. And if it's set up correctly with the correct security groups, you can SSH into the master node. What I'm going to do is I'm going to edit the security groups associated with these instances so I can try and log into them. By the way, have you ever noticed that the security groups are attached to the networking tab? You might think, why are security groups networking? Why aren't they directly attached to the instance? And there's another very interesting thing that hopefully most of you know about, but not a lot of other people know about, and that is that a security group is not actually attached to an instance. A security group is actually attached to a network interface, or an ENI, Elastic Network Interface. And you can have multiple network cards plugged into your virtual machine, multiple ENIs, and the security groups attached to those ENIs. And this is important because you might create a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, where you've got traffic coming in one side and then traffic coming out the other end into your nice clean thing. And that instance is acting as a firewall. And so you can attach different security groups to each ENI. So little tidbit, security groups are attached to ENI. ENIs are network interfaces, which is why security groups are under the network pull down thing. So I'm going to say allow SSH. I've got a security group here where I can allow all SSH into that instance. And I'll do the same for this one. Security groups are additive. So it doesn't matter what other things were granted, as long as I give one that has SSH access, that will work. Okay, so now theoretically, one of these is the master node. Here it is. The master node is the one that ends with 1, 2, 3. So I can connect into that with SSH. My key pair. When you log into an EMR cluster, you do it with Hadoop at, and I'm logged into my master node. Isn't this pretty? It comes up with a big EMR logo. So this is the master node. However, the person was asking, can he connect to the child node? Once I'm here, just to prove that I'm connected to a Hadoop system, I can do things like run Hive. John says, I like to use SSM port forwarding for SSHing into servers. Yeah, much safer than having your servers accessible to the outside world. Using SSM port forwarding, not just SSH. Yes. So with SSM, the systems manager, session manager, you can not only connect into an instance, even in a private subnet, but you can do port forwarding across it. It's great. So I've managed to launch a Windows instance in a private subnet with no internet gateway, so totally inaccessible. And then I use the session manager to connect into it. The way that works is there's an agent installed in the instance that goes outwards. So that's how I can connect to it, even though there's no, it has to be an internet gateway. There was an internet gateway, but it was in a private subnet. So the agent punched out through a NAT gateway to the outside world. I could then port forward RDP to a Windows instance running in a private subnet. It was great being able to connect to private instances. Anyway, so here I've got my master node, but let's try and connect to my master node and tell the person if it's possible. So the IP address is this thing here. Run that command again. And I log into my task node. Looks like it's fine to me. I'm connected to the task node. So, answered that one. Did answer that one, didn't I? Yep. So here it is. Yes. I went to the EC2 console. I can SSH in the master node. I can't find the IP address of the associated node. So the simple trick is by looking in the EC2 console to get the IP address is the trick. And it works. And there we are. Those of you who have never used EMR before, you've learned not much about EMR, but you now know it has master nodes and secondary nodes where you can run lots of things. Hadoop is based on, is trying to figure out how to shut down this cluster. Terminate. Hadoop is based on the very original Google file system. There's an amazing document out there. Google file system. And I learned EMR exists. That's almost all you need for some of these things. The Google file system, when was this written? I don't have a date on here. 2003. The Google file system was Google's attempt to say, hey, how do we gather lots and lots of stuff when we scrape websites from all around the world? And we've got to store it somewhere. And we don't really care about updating this information. We just want to store it and dump it somewhere. And then we want to run queries going across it to do web searches. And so they came up with this concept of doing highly parallel things. They download information, they store it in chunks, they replicate the chunks between machines in case they lose data. And then they run highly parallel tasks that go across the whole system. And that's what originally powered the whole of Google search. There's no more pretty pictures here. And then people said, this is a really clever idea. So they made a similar thing, called it Hadoop. And Hadoop is primarily a system that allows you to run parallel tasks. You break down a job into smaller things. Let's say you've got several terabytes of data you want to query across. You say, oh, I've got 10 machines. Each machine's going to do a chunk of that data, go off and work in parallel. As they produce the results, they send that information back to the master node, and the master node puts it together and returns. So the example I like to use is if you want to do a search for Swiss cheese, one node might go off and look for Swiss in the S index. One node might go off and look for cheese in the C index. They find all the web pages that have both of them. They bring it together, union the result together and say which ones have both Swiss and cheese, and then return those pages back. So pretty fun. I think you can use SSM port forwarding with SSM VPC endpoints to avoid the NAT gateway. So John P, you're saying there's a VPC endpoint. You might have to try this. There's a VPC endpoint. The documentation keeps changing, but I go for this link here. So AWS services you can use with private link, and systems manager, no. So it says there is no VPC endpoint for systems manager. So apparently you can't do it. So when you run the SSM agent on an EC2 instance that is installed by default on Amazon Linux 2, it punches out through your NAT gateway out your VPC and connects with AWS, and AWS can then do an inbound request to the SSM agent to do things like the run command or the session manager. It looks like there is no VPC endpoint for the agent to get out because it's not really connecting. Yeah, you can figure out how to do that. Endpoint for SSM systems manage, no, session manager. That way you could have a really totally private. We had a VPC endpoint for systems manager. It says you can. Interface endpoint. Why is it saying you can? Create, set up, create VPC systems manager. Create a virtual VPC endpoint. Oh, okay. So there is an SSM. So that documentation page is not reliable for me. So we'll give this a go. Give this a go. Let's try it out. Step 1, we will create a VPC that has no internet gateway. I always like experimenting. Let's create. We're going to do the impossible. We're going to create a stack private VPC. Create a subnet inside of it. So if you want to connect your VPC to the internet, you normally need to use an internet gateway to connect to the outside. Oh no, you'd need an internet gateway, but no, we need a public and private subnet, don't we? No, we don't, because I'm going to use a VPC endpoint. Thank you. So I have a subnet. We have a subnet. I can choose my VPC down here if I refresh. And my stack private has a subnet. And I'm going to launch an EC2 instance in that subnet. The security group attached to a VPC endpoint must allow incoming connections for 443 from the private subnet of the managed instance. Yeah, fine. So let's launch an instance in my private VPC, my private subnet, no public IP address. Before I do that, we want to create a VPC endpoint. Endpoints. SSM. Here's the SSM endpoint. Oh, I've got to hit search. Okay. So I create a SSM endpoint in my stack private VPC. Tell it to do everything automatically for me. Requires DNS support and DNS host names set to true. Go back to my VPC. This thing, DNS host names enable. Solution, no. VPC endpoint or SSM. So let's recap. For those of you who have just joined us, we're experimenting for a reason that I can't quite remember at the moment. We're going to create a private VPC with no internet gateway. And we're going to try and connect to an instance inside that VPC by using the systems manager. The EC2 instance I'm about to launch will have an agent installed on it that will connect to SSM by going through a VPC endpoint that we just created on the VPC. You need to give it an IAM role with SSM access, can do. And that should then, the agent should punch out through the VPC endpoint for SSM, connect to AWS SSM service. We should then be able to SSH in the instance via the systems manager. And for added bonus points, we could do port forwarding on top of that SSH connection, even though it's not really SSH, it's really just remote connection. So I've got to give it an IAM role with permissions that John's pointed out. I've got to say launch it in my private stack. And I think that's all we need to do. It's going to be my secret instance. Security group is unimportant because everything is going out. So I'm just going to give it, for a bit of fun, we're going to remove no inbound security on that, that instance. So not only is it in a VPC with no internet gateway, it's also got a security group that's blocking out all inbound access, and we are going to try and connect to it. 443 outbound, it will have default outbound connectivity in there. Security group, which is somewhere in this new console. Where is the security group? Ah, it's in a different tab. security group has all outbound enabled. So yes, you must give it outbound connectivity so the agent, SSM agent on the instance can punch out and get going there. So now I go into the, oops, wrong console thing. I go into the systems manager console. If we are lucky and the instance booted up and did everything that it wants, it should appear in the list of instances available in the session manager. We'll give it a bit longer to boot up and hopefully get it going. Show me my running. Instance state running. My secret instance here, still initializing. I hope it will work without internet access. Hope it doesn't have to install anything when it boots up to get that going. It'll work. We might have to come back to this in a few minutes. See if it's coming there. Let's look for another question in the meantime. We answered that one. Thank you very much. I can get rid of that. Get rid of that. I don't know why we're doing this experiment, but it's fun anyway. Let's look for something else while we're doing that. Here's a common thing that I see for people with Lambda. I'm trying to create a Lambda function that downloads 2 files from S3, 10 gigs each. I'm only able to write to the /temp folder directory. There's a limit of 500 megabytes, actually 512 megabytes. Is there a way to download these files via Lambda? So this is a common problem. Lambda only gives you a small amount of space because it's a temporary container. But the recent thing that has come out is that you can now use EFS with Lambda. And we tried this a few shows ago. I got most of the way. And you can now mount the elastic file system on your Lambda drive. So EFS is a network-based file system. And the fact you can mount it on Lambda means a few things. First of all, we can get more than 512 meg storage. Secondly, it's shared storage across all of your Lambdas. And third, a lot of libraries that you previously had to load within a Lambda layout, and there's limitations on that, you can now put on EFS and access directly from disk. So it's a thing well worth knowing about. How's our instance going over here? Look at our list of instances. That has now booted up. We go to the system manager and it ain't working. So it does have a role that I know has lots of permissions. Let's check that. My ops role that I assigned it, I believe, has admin access. Means it will be able to connect to the SSM service. Yep, it's got administrator access, so it's not a permissioning issue. It might be an issue with the way the VPC endpoint was set up. It's always a mystery to me. I go to the subnet for the route table. It doesn't have a route table entry that points to the VPC endpoint, but from what I understand, it's meant to be automatic. How much memory would you need to give a Lambda to read a 10 gig file? Yeah, somebody was suggesting you could load it all in memory, but that's not really what Lambda is for. And the more memory you give it, the more you have to pay for Lambda, so it might not work out from an economical perspective. So my VPC endpoint for SSM, is it attached to a subnet? It is attached to the subnet, so I don't know what more I would need to modify here to get it going. Security group has outbound access. I'm saddened by this. No matching. Has all the outbound access required. So either it did not have the SSM agent installed or something else is going wrong. Did you set up the route table entry for the VPC endpoint? Do I need to do that, or does it happen automatically? Let's see. I thought that sort of thing happens automatically. Let's see. So if I edit the route table association, nope, I want to edit the route table itself. Let's edit the routes, the routes, whatever you want to say. And I say a target is, I can't see anything. Maybe look in the ENI, the one for the endpoint on the private subnet. So I can't target a VPC endpoint because I think it happens automatically. I don't need to do anything there. The CNIs, network interfaces. We want it to be in the VPC that starts with the 0C. Network interface starting VPC ending with 0C is this one here. So the network interface is in there, but I don't know why you wouldn't have allowed it to work. You managed to do it. Let me know. Something fun to talk about since I'm failing and I've got to distract you. Don't know if you saw this. We recently introduced T4 instances. So the T instances are very interesting instance types that are burstable. The idea is normally when you launch an EC2 instance, we give you a certain amount of CPU, a certain amount of RAM, a certain amount of disk, and it's yours. No one else can interfere with that. We don't share resources with anyone else. The T family is a little bit different in that it's burstable. So you can go above baseline usage, but you can't do that forever. If you do it for too long, we block you off. So it's great for where you have bursty workloads, things like websites that are only used occasionally, or maybe you've got batch jobs running on some systems, and the T family is great. I hardly remember the T1s. The T1s had limited burst capabilities. T2, you got this credit system where when you don't burst for very long, you earn credits, and then you can use them to burst later. T3 was more powerful, and now we've just introduced the first T4, which is one of the Graviton processors. Now, the Graviton processor is an ARM-based machine, and that means it won't run all of your software unless you get to recompile it. So it's not an x86 processor, but you can use a Graviton. So let's actually give that a go. Let's go into instances and have a look at one of these fancy new machines. Down here, I've got to choose in here. Instead of using an x86, I can say, please select an ARM AMI because it's been compiled for the ARM processor. I will come in here and say, find me a, it's not in Sydney. Let's change to Ohio. Looks like it's been released only in US East, US West, Tokyo, and Ireland. Notice nothing ever happens with US West 1, the one in Northern California. It's sort of the forgotten region that no one talks about anymore. So let's give this a go. I will choose an ARM AMI. And I will, oh, look, they're at the top of the list. I'll go for a T4G Micro. And name. And my little bit of experimentation of it found that quite a few things I could install and use on it, but some things, there's not enough libraries out there that they only assume x86 processors. So here is my T4 launching. Are there any T4 x86s? No. So if I go to the list of official instance types out there, there's a T4G is the only thing at the moment. So there's T3, T3A, which A is an AMD. It doesn't stand for ARM, it stands for AMD, so slightly lower cost using that. But at the moment, at least, there's no T4 x86. It might come, it might not come. We've come out with that one first. So let's log into this fellow. Go away. Get bigger. So it looks like a perfectly normal Amazon Linux instance. And I can do things like go in here, sudo. So I don't think Python 3 is installed here. Yay, so lots of things out there seem to work. And the interesting thing is I think this thing here says it's an ARM architecture 64, so it is not the x86 architecture. How hard is it to run a real world project? There's a lot of case studies out there, some videos from reInvent and all that, where companies said, yeah, they just took a day or so to recompile a lot of their code to work on the other architecture. And they immediately got a cost saving and a 20% boost. And the Graviton 2 processors are much better than the original Graviton. So looks like as long as there is libraries out there that can handle the ARM architecture, you can get it going. I tried installing the Linux desktop called Mate. Looks like Mate, but it's Mate. And that didn't work because they didn't have the code libraries out there. But if you're just running perfectly normal things and scripts, use the Graviton and it's faster and lower cost. John's pointing out when you specify the VPC route table, it's automatically added to the route tables with a destination of the prefix, but it wasn't added in there. When you create or modify an endpoint, the route table is used to access the service, so it should have worked for us. I'm a little disappointed about why that didn't work for us. Anyway. Oh, here's another tip. Somebody was saying, I have an S3 bucket with 9 terabytes of data that I want to copy to another AWS account. What would be the fastest and most cost-efficient way to copy it? I know I can rsync. Oh, rsync is awful. That means you'd have to download from S3, re-upload to S3. So if you do it from EC2, it's not too bad, but you'd be copying a lot of data. You should always copy between buckets by using the S3 copy command, and Amazon takes care of that. I've not played with S3 replication. So S3 replication is when you can say, I want to replicate between buckets, either same region or cross region, but it only replicates objects that are created after you've turned on replication. So it's not a way to replicate existing things. And somebody's come along and said, I think you've got to do a sync. I disagree, because I know, well, I read this blog post recently, last month, cross-account bulk transfer of files using Amazon S3 batch operations. They can have millions to billions of objects in S3. So I've never played with S3 batch, but S3 batch is a way to go in and say, please perform an operation across a large number of S3 objects. It's not cross-region replication. Well, this is cross, you can cross between buckets, basically. Batch can copy between buckets. So what they say is you need a list of S3 objects to operate on, and you can use S3 inventory. S3 inventory can give you a daily or think weekly dump, a CSV file listing all the objects in your bucket. So if you've got millions of objects, it's much easier to get a daily S3 inventory list. Then you can use that CSV file as a manifest, telling it to copy things between the two accounts. Is there a way to sync from S3 to EFS? I have seen something out there, but I think it involved having to use an EC2 instance. Using data sync to transfer from EFS to S3. Data sync is a service we have that I haven't played with, where it does highly efficient data transfer things. It's a bit like the BitTorrent protocol. I think it uses UDP, highly efficient, takes full advantage of the bandwidth that's there. I'm not sure if it actually, in the data sync console, you've got to create a task, and I suspect that it launches something either in your VPC or behind the scenes, but you have to pay for that service while it's running. So you're effectively paying for that task. Whereas S3 batch doesn't involve any machines to go up and going. Let's have a quick look at S3 batch. Create a job. I can input it from an S3 inventory report. So you get that weekly or daily S3 inventory report. You can use it as input, or you can use it as a CSV. And can't go further unless I give it figure an inventory list. Let's see if we give it a CSV file, and I just create a quick one. Just want to see what options it's got. S3. Can I fake it? No, it actually wants file to exist. Can I give it a fake file? Or am I going to have to give it? Hey, let me go to the next page. So it looks like it can copy objects listed in the manifest to the specified destination. Ew, it can invoke a Lambda function on each object. That's fancy. So let's say you want to process each object. You can trigger Lambda. Replace tags. Update the ACLs. Restore from Glacier. That's how you can restore lots of objects from Glacier. Normally the restore command is one object at a time. You can change object lock. Object lock is the thing that says, oh, please prevent this object, or more specifically this version of an object, from being deleted. And there's two versions of that. Object lock is a voluntary thing where you say, don't let it be deleted, but you can turn it off whenever you wish. And legal hold is a way of doing the same thing, but you can give it a length of time. Oh no, it's vice versa, sorry. Object lock retention is you say this length of time. Legal hold is just an optional turn it on, turn it off so that people don't accidentally delete it. I have been in a company one time where we accidentally threw out some physical files, and later a customer took us to court over an issue, and we needed those physical files to claim our innocence. So I now fully understand that holding documents for legal purposes can be very, very useful. We didn't realize it at the time when we did the cleanup. So let's say copy. Looks like you can put in any S3. Must be in the same region. You are right. This will not work cross account. Run says, I use S3 fuse to mount S3 into EC2, use rsync to keep S3 mount folder and EFS folder. That's to copy from S3 to EFS. Yeah, that'll work. So it looks like batch copying is very, very good, except it will only work in the same region. Your destination must be in the region where the job is created. So we go back to the question, and they're saying they want to copy between accounts. They don't mention regions. Look for the word region. The source will be in the same region. Yay! You can use S3 batch documentation. I'd like to put a link to the documentation. You can use S3 batch operations to copy output of S3 inventory. I have a link. I refer to it a lot. Provide a daily or weekly listing of all objects. While copying tags, metadata, and ACL. C. File. One. Cross account transfers. Put a link to that one in. Paste it in. And we are done. Lots of question answering here. Got a comment here. This little one on my inbox is an indication that somebody has responded to another thing that I've been participating in. Creating an S3 bucket. I'm getting this error. Signature does not match. I've tried changing the key 2 times. I'm still having an issue. And I previously said, where are you doing this? I'm running it in PuTTY on my own computer. That is not an answer. If you're running it in PuTTY, then you're probably connecting to an EC2 instance. So do you know PuTTY has a big TTY, and that's because it's like an old terminal on a teletype machine. Those of you who are too young to remember, teletype were these old typewriter-like things that connected to mainframe computers, and used to interface with them by using these old teletype machines. So PuTTY is a play on the TTY, which is the old terminal teletype thing. What else do we have for a bit of fun here? Told you about that, told you about that. I'm a bit of a Redshift person. And there was a very interesting announcement that just came out this week. There is a new data API for Redshift. So Redshift is a database based on Postgres. So a traditional database that you connect to using a traditional SQL client. And that means while you could make an API call to AWS and say, please create me a Redshift database, please modify my security groups, please create a snapshot, to actually connect to the database, you had to use an SQL client like a JDBC, ODBC to connect into the database, which was pretty hard, especially if you're doing things like Lambda. If a Lambda function wanted to connect to Redshift, you would have to connect into the VPC, open up a JDBC connection. A lot of people use, what's the Python thing? PostgreSQL, Pygress, or SQL Python. There's a great library that a lot of people use. I've forgotten the name of it. Psycho PG2. So I don't know what it stands for, but Psycho PG2 is a great way of connecting to a Postgres database from Python. But now it seems you can access using a built-in data API to simplify access, ingest, etc., and use the normal SDK, which is fantastic. Removes the need to manage the database connections and credentials. You can execute SQL commands through the API. The API takes care of managing database connections and return the data. The one question I have is, does that mean you don't need to connect to the VPC to run it? So using Lambda provides a secure way to access the database without the overhead of Lambda functions to be launched in a VPC. Yes, that means you can now launch Lambda connected to the internet, run some SQL commands to the data API, and it magically somehow through the backend will connect into Redshift and run the queries for you. So this is pretty good news. So very nice for the people who want to use Redshift. I have to play with that sometime. Also, I bookmark this thing. For those of you who are not too aware of it, there's a lot of, I see a lot of questions on Stack Overflow about people wanting to connect to S3 compatible services. So a lot of companies have adopted a storage service that use the same S3 APIs to connect in. But a lot of people just want to have a local S3 service or a local DynamoDB or something to develop their code locally without having to use the cloud. And a great thing to do there is this thing called Local Stack. Originally developed, I think, by Atlassian, a good Australian company. Used to work for them. And now it seems to be mostly it's open source, but it seems to be run by a British company. And so Local Stack is the ability to effectively download the cloud on your own computer. And it has local equivalents to a lot of AWS services. Now, they obviously won't be as performant as AWS. Like they've got Redshift. I don't know if that just means that you can launch a cluster. But I don't know if you can actually run queries within their equivalent to Redshift. Maybe it mocks it with a PostgreSQL. But really great work in having all of these services. So if you're doing automated testing, you could fire up a Local Stack service, test locally against it, rather than having to launch services in the cloud. So not as performant, but much better from cost management. D14 RGT says, any tips for using Quarkus and Lambda? It says Java thing. I've never heard of Quarkus. If I search for Quarkus, am I going to get into trouble? Supersonic subatomic Java. Kubernetes native Java stack tailored for lots of stuff. I've never heard of it, so I can't comment on that. So I know that Lambda, Lambda custom somethings, custom runtimes. So it used to be that each year we would release new runtimes. We now support Java, we now support .NET, we now support Go. And I think they were getting tired of doing that all the time. So they introduced this ability to have a custom Lambda runtime. And you can basically tell it to load up a runtime when Lambda starts, and so you can have a language of your choice. So if you can build a custom runtime for Quarkus, then I guess you would be able to use it in Lambda. So I wish you well if you get that going. Okay, let's find something else to do. Alarm for a time range. Oh, that's an interesting one. I want to create an alarm for a particular time window. So the use case is if we see customer traffic drop from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., then we should get an alarm to know why customers are not using our service and to take some action. In this scenario, you say scenario or scenario? Is it possible through CloudWatch? We have the number of request metric in place. I'm not familiar with the ability in CloudWatch to specify a time period, but I am familiar because if you watch CQ, the certification quiz show this week, we had a question. We might not have had a question, it might be next week, on this. And CloudWatch has a thing called anomaly detection. And the neat thing about CloudWatch anomaly detection is it looks at the normal range of patterns over a period of time, and it can identify when things go outside that normal pattern. So while this is not the equivalent of saying I want to create an alarm during work hours to see if, what did they say? Why customers are not using our service. So they're saying if there are fewer customers than I expect, please notify me. I think it's a perfect excuse to be using anomaly detection. So let's tell them that. Watch anomaly detection. I'd like to put a link into the documentation. Might even steal some of that text. And let's link to the what's new. When did it come out? 2019. Beautiful. A good example of using AI there, rather than specifying what is a good value, what's normal. It looks like it can even detect days of the week, patterns like this that it knows at certain times of day or on certain days it goes up and down. So once it's collected enough data, it can actually give you a very good anomaly detection. Thank you very much, AI. Tags look good. Something down the bottom I want to talk about here. Allowing public access. Oh, this was a good one. So this person's saying, how can I restore an S3 object from Glacier using a tag? So Glacier, there's two ways you can use Glacier. One is the Glacier service itself, where you can send jobs to Glacier and you can create archives to store things. Glacier is very unfriendly to use. It takes a long time too. You put a request in and a few hours later things come back. So the folks in S3 thought it'd be a really great idea to make Glacier easier to use. And if you have something in random bucket, you have something in S3, you can change the storage class. And you can come in here and say, I would like to change my, no, can't change my storage. Oh, here it is. I can change my storage class, and they introduced this thing called Glacier, which is much lower cost, and Glacier Deep Archive that is really a lot lower cost. The thing to know about Glacier is that when you want to restore, it takes time to restore. And depending on how much you're willing to pay, it takes longer or shorter. If you don't want to pay much, it takes longer to come back, half a day. If you want things back within a few minutes, you can pay for it. And so it's a great way of storing data you don't need very often, but when you do need it, you can still get it back. And the pricing is quite amazing. You look at the comparison of storage costs. Normally in S3, you're looking around about 2 cents a gig. If you want to store in Glacier, you're looking at 0.4 cents a gig. And if you want to use Glacier Deep Archive, it's 0.1 of a gig, 0.1 cents per gig. So really low cost when worthwhile using. So that's what Glacier is all about. So the folks in S3 said, hey, we can automatically move things to Glacier if you want. You won't see it in Glacier, but we'll manage it for you. So this person's saying, I would like to use a key pair tag on my objects to retrieve into Glacier. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Can you do it? And they want to do it in the CLI. So in the CLI, there is a restore command for Glacier, and it's called restore object. So you say AWS S3 API restore object, and the information you give it is you tell it which bucket and which key. So this will only work for one object. So there is no filter here. There's no way to specify a particular tag. So then I thought, okay, obviously what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to list your S3 bucket, find the objects with a particular tag, and then call the restore object command for each one of those objects. G'day, Santi D Gamer from Argentina. Yoo-hoo! So I then went to the list buckets command. Actually, I'm going to go to the Boto S3 interface because it gives a nice way of seeing what you can do when you list a bucket. And there is a command here called list objects. And what I discovered, it was quite interesting, is when you list an object, it comes back with information. It tells you in the bucket, what's the key, when was it modified, what's the E tag. This isn't a tag, this is a checksum on the file. What's its size, what's its storage class. But nowhere in here does it have a tag. And what I discovered is there is no way to get a listing of your bucket, including the tags associated with an object. So if we go to a specific object, you can add a tag to the object. Properties, tags. I want to add a tag. Food equals cheese. And I save that tag on my object. The only way to get that back is to specifically call a command that says get the tagging for this object. And that means the only way you can find objects with a particular tag is to list the objects in the bucket. For each object, call the get tag command, and then if that tag is the thing you want, then call the Glacier thing to get it back. So I thought that was pretty bad. Can you do that with the S3 batch tool? The batch tool, so the batch tool, you're right. The batch tool has a Glacier restore option, but could it do it with tags? Could it do it with tags? I like what you're thinking there, Rex. Have a look. No, because the batch operation, while it does do a restore, it needs a list of objects. And I also examined S3 inventory. And S3 inventory does not return a list of tags. So the things you can get back from S3 inventory, sorry for lots of scrolling, the bucket, the key, the version, the size, you do not get back the tags associated to an object. So again, you've got the problem of how to get the list of objects that have a particular tag to then pass to batch. But I do like the idea of using batch instead of doing it. Yeah, now metadata is a different matter. Does S3 inventory do metadata? You can configure what object metadata to include and only include current versions. Now, Metadata, I don't think is the same as tags. No, it's the following metadata is listed. So unfortunately, it isn't there, but I like the idea of batch. Link to batch. S3 batch operations can, oops. Okay, so too bad trying to do that one. Okay. It's, this was an interesting one. It's well worth knowing about. So this person is wanting to have a secret in the secrets manager. The secrets manager is a great place to store configuration information, passwords, and things like that that you want to control. So rather than storing on an instance, your software can call the secrets manager and say, please give me the password for XYZ. And this person has a secret that is so secret that they only want one role to be able to access it. So even if somebody has admin permissions, they shouldn't be able to do it. And they were trying to get it working. So what they've done is they've said, allow this particular role to get access to the secret and disallow these other roles to get access. And that worked fine. But what they want to do is deny all roles without explicitly mentioning them. And it wasn't quite working. So they said, allow this role, but deny everything else. But unfortunately, that deny overruled their allow. And I managed to answer this, and not many people know about it, but policies have this thing called a not principle. You've also got not actions and not conditions. So in this case, you can specify deny access to this particular secret if the principle is not this one, and therefore it will deny everybody else. So it's a much easier way than having to specifically deny each role. So that's a handy thing to know about. At least I thought it was pretty good. This is an old one that I thought was pretty interesting. This person's saying they've got a version bucket and they want to use object locks. That's the one that we were just talking about. What's the difference between parameter store and secrets manager? I have no idea, frankly. There are some different rules. I think you can put a policy on a secret to specifically grant access to it, right, which you can't do in parameter store, but I see them as similar uses. Secrets manager also includes the ability to automatically rotate keys. So let's say you have a password. Let's say you have a password on a RDS database, a relational database service, and you've stored the password in secrets manager. We have the ability to automatically rotate the password. And what it really is, it's a Lambda function that will connect to your RDS instance, change the password, then go to secrets manager and change the password stored in there. So you can set a schedule and say, please rotate the password every 30 days, and that will do it for you automatically there. So if in doubt, use the secrets manager for password type things and use the parameter store for configuration type things. A good example of parameter store is the systems manager. No, the CloudWatch agent. When you deploy the CloudWatch agent on machines, it can actually retrieve configuration from parameter store and configure itself. So instead of having to push a configuration file down to an EC2 instance, it can retrieve the configuration from parameter store. So that's another good use of configuration information. Otherwise, V4 I don't know a clear delineation of when you would use each of these. This person was interesting. They were saying they've got object lock on something and they want to create a lifecycle policy that will transition older files to a different storage class. So it's a lower cost. And they were wondering if there's a conflict. So this is worth digging deep. So object lock requires versioning to be turned on. And if you create a lifecycle policy says, hey, if I've got an object older than a certain amount, please perform some action on it. So the question is, if you were to change the storage class of an object and you've got versioning turned on, what will happen? Does it create a new version in the other storage class, or does it change the storage class of the existing version? And I managed to find something in the object lock documentation that said object lock is maintained regardless of which storage class the object resides in, and throughout S3 lifecycle transitions between storage classes. So this didn't fully answer whether the lifecycle transition causes a new version to be created. So I was going to experiment with that, but a lifecycle transition requires a minimum of 30 days to be a transition, and I couldn't answer quickly as a result of that. But it's interesting that object lock maintains itself even when an object transitions storage classes. And an object lock works on one version of an object, so that makes me think that the version will transition without creating a new version. Oh well, that's been about an hour and a half, so I'm going to say we answered a nice set of questions for today. We'll see over my next day if people vote those questions as being correct. So I will say thank you for joining me as I answered Stack Overflow questions. I'm now going to go out on this beautiful day here in Sydney. It's going to be 29 degrees Celsius. What's that in? That's 84 degrees it's going to reach today, in a lovely spring day in Sydney. So thank you for joining me. Come along next week. We'll be on next week as we answer more Stack Overflow questions. And please, when you hop into Stack Overflow, you see a question, an answer you like, please hit that uptick, and please do try and answer some questions yourself. So my name's John. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a good day / evening / Costa Rica / Argentina, wherever you are. Have a good day. See ya.